Buen día. Yo estoy contento de esa oportunidad, como cada año, de encontrar a los amigos de Argentina, del instituto, Pepe, los colegas. Pero como mi castellano no es tan bueno para tener una conferencia, voy a seguir en inglés. Pero sin embargo, obviamente, puedo tomar preguntas en castellano en final. Sí. So let's switch to English. I will try to be to speak slowly and so to be understood more easily. This is by the way, the new hospital in Perugia that Professor Millet made reference to, and that where I currently work. When I was given this topic, I started thinking how to set up this talk, because in my mind, after all, it is an important issue, but I didn't think that there was so much of a European flavor that needed to be put under focus, honestly. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in fact, there may be some interesting things to discuss looking from the other side of the ocean. We have already heard about this, but the interesting thing is now thinking with the European focus in mind, is that after all, this is a relatively new classification. As we have heard, this dates back to 2008, and as you will see, it comes from Italy, Finland, London, Melbourne. It's one of the few things that has not been originated in the United States in our field. And in fact, there is a prominent relevance of European clinicians, for one thing. We have already heard about the various classifications, so I will not spend any words on that. But just to convince you how important, how seminal this consensus was, look at how the papers on cardiorenal syndrome have exploded since the publication of this consensus conference in 2008. So there is a 50-fold increase in the awareness of this disease. And this is this goes to credit to the European investigators and clinicians. Now, what I think the major problem is, however, is that we have heard the other colleagues trying to explain the various types of cardiorenal syndromes, what makes them more or less important. Now, one of the problems that I can see, speaking from Italy, but I'm sure it's the same here as well, is that unfortunately, what comes out on paper is not necessarily what we see in our wards every day, because guidelines, randomized clinical trials, position papers are based on certain categories of patients that do not necessarily represent the majority of whom we see every day. So let me give you some examples. So how many patients in the real world would have satisfied the inclusion criteria of randomized clinical trials when it comes to congestive heart failure and kidney dysfunction? So for one thing, if you look this is a list of all major trials in heart failure. Well, all of them actually excluded patients with moderate to severe heart failure, by definition, as an entry exclusion criterion. But even worse, if you look at what the average creatinine was, I was almost normal. I wouldn't speculate more than that. Now, we have heard about the difficulties in engaging from creatinine, but definitely creatinine of 1.2 in patients with congestive heart failure, it's almost normal. So we have no hard data when it comes to using either ACE inhibitors or beta blockade or aldosterone antagonist in our congestive heart failure patients, in whom we know that maybe 30% will have a kidney failure just because those patients were not studied. That's one example. Let's have a look from another point of view. Now, let's see what is the picture, what we see in our everyday practice. So I will just focus on this since we want to stay focused on Europe. This is the Italian registry with congestive heart failure. Well, 50% of patients had more than 2.5 milliliters, a milligram per deciliter creatinine. So well above the average and well above the inclusion criteria of most clinical trials. That's not only that. Clinical trials tend to enroll young patients. So the average age of randomized clinical trials in heart failure is around 60. Now, the average age of congestive heart failure patients in our world is 75. So very, very much different. Same story goes for the gender. Randomized clinical trials tend not to enroll women, less than 25%. Whereas now we know that with this disease, the congestive heart failure patients tend to be roughly 40% women. Now, why this is important, particularly the age story? Because going back to kidney failure, age is a clear factor that promotes development of chronic renal failure, and therefore you will see the difference. There is only 10% prevalence of chronic kidney disease in subjects less than 65, which is still above the average age for heart failure trials that we mentioned. Now, if we go here, we jump to 75%. So bottom line is there is about a 10 milliliters per minute loss in filtration rate for each 10 years of age. And it's not only that. Now we come to another point. If those patients are older, then by definition they tend to be sicker and have worse congestive heart failure. If they have worse kidney function. If they have kidney function, in addition to everything we have heard today, they tend to have reduced excretion of several drugs. So that has an impact. And the impact is twofold. It's a practical impact in the sense that, of course, we should adjust for this, and sometimes we don't. And there is also a psychological impact. We will see this in a second. That physicians, for fear of patients not being able to correctly dispose of drugs because of a possible kidney impairment, tend not to prescribe certain drugs or to use too low of a dose, just to avoid this risk. But that is not good either. Now let's have a look at this. This is again Europe data. Now that's, for instance, The prescription of ACE inhibitors varies very much with age. You will see. So under prescription over 70s. Same story with renal dysfunction. Under prescription, substantial under prescription with renal dysfunction. And this is as far as prescribing or not prescribing. But even when it is prescribed, it is done at a lower dose. Look at this. In the presence of renal dysfunction, there is a tendency to prescribe fewer patients and with lower doses of either ACE inhibitors or spironolactone. And that could have some impact. Now, another thing that I would like to discuss with you, and having a look from the European side, we have heard that there is at least 4 categories of cardiorenal syndrome, the 5th being the one that is secondary to other things. And we've been describing and separating the acute versus the chronic development of that. Now, I would like to focus, being a cardiologist, on a separate thing, which is what is the incidence of heart, now regardless of the pathophysiology, whether it's type 1, 2, 3, or 4, what is the prevalence of kidney dysfunction in heart failure patients according to their presentation? So what is the clinical profile of a patient with acute heart failure or a patient with a chronic heart failure? They're not identical from the standing point of cardiac function. How about from the kidney function standpoint? And this is something where Europe, again, has contributed a lot. Now, these are recent data, 2011, from a Czech registry. And the interesting thing is, so what are the baseline characteristics of this acute heart failure database? We're talking about over 4,000 patients, so very interesting, very recent, 2011. I will obviously only focus on what we're most interested in. I will not get into all the various classifications of acute heart failure, but suffice it to say that overall, now we have, see, that female are more than 40%, represent more than 40%. Patients over 70 years old are more than 60%. I mean, I don't know here, but you ask for the Enfoque Europeo. Now, this is the type of patients we see. Women, old women, mostly. 43% had diabetes. 43%, compared to an average in this age in the general population of about 12%, 15% at most. So there is clearly a disproportion. And of course, ejection fraction was reduced. Now, getting more into the kidney story, I would focus just on the second panel. This one doesn't tell much. The upper panel here is that what are the predictors of in-hospital mortality? And by in-hospital, we mean by definition within 30 days of admission. Not necessarily patients have to stay in the hospital, but if it happens within 30 days of admission, it's considered in-hospital mortality. And now you will see that, of course, it's age, ejection fraction, creatinine, and for our friend, the intensivist, the intensive ventilation, of course. Now, the interesting thing is that this is the univariable. The multivariable is roughly tells the same story. And then this is whether they have cardiogenic shock or no cardiogenic shock. But as you will see, without cardiogenic shock, it's even closer to what we're interested in, because now we start having also sodium and potassium electrolytes coming into the picture. So there is no question that renal dysfunction superimposed on acute heart failure is a problem. That was a Czech registry. At about a couple of years earlier, we did the same thing in Italy as well, and we also participated in this. So once again, it's acute heart failure patients. In the words, many words in Italy, we talk about 3,000 patients. Same story. Look at this. The average age, I know that you don't believe this, but it's 73. The average, with half of the patients roughly being older than 75. And once again, 40% female. In this population, once again, renal failure was present in about 1 out of 4 patients, 25%, and diabetes, once again, close to 40%. That's the total population. Now, there are small differences between worsening heart failure or de novo, but that's the story. Maybe we can skip this, but if you want to just concentrate on creatinine and glomerular filtration rate, you will see that 60% of patients have moderate to severe glomerular filtration rate, below 60 or even below 30. Now, what are the independent predictors? Again, those were the Czech patients. These are the Italian patients. Similar. Inotropes, troponin, of course, systolic blood pressure, age, and interestingly, even more than creatinine, blood urea nitrogen and again the sodium and hemoglobin that we have just saw before. So very, very similar results. Now that was 2006, and that was acute heart failure. What about if we now start moving on to the chronic heart failure patients? And we do this in a registry that, again, we also participated, that actually did both things. So after 7 years, we repeated the acute picture, but this time we added also another 38,000 patients with chronic heart failure. And the second difference being that these were hospitalized and this one were outpatients. Are there differences in this? That we'll see. Okay, again, I will not bother you with all the clinical characteristics, but one again, blood urea nitrogen and creatinine were powerful predictor of 1-year mortality for patients admitted to the hospital with acute heart failure, but creatinine remained with almost the same degree of predictivity, also for 1-year mortality for outpatient with chronic heart failure. So it really is something that is overarching, is regardless of the reason the patient gets to the hospital, regarding of the underlying cardiac disease, is the presence itself of kidney dysfunction that matters. Now, we have heard about iatrogenia, no? So can treatment heart failure paradoxically aggravate renal dysfunction? And of course the answer is yes, but let's have a look once again from the Italian registry that we mentioned before. This is another analysis that we participated in. So what are the independent predictors of in-hospital death for patients admitted with acute heart failure? Now, look, of course, is glomerular filtration rate or below 50, or any measurement that does not meet 50. So 8 times, it increases the risk 8 times. But that's not so interesting. The thing is, what are the predictors of mortality? Is the worsening of renal failure. So not so much renal failure per se, but much more than that is the development of new renal failure or a worsening of renal failure. That matters even more when it comes to acutely hospitalized patients. Then the question is, and what are the determinants of the worsening heart failure? Something that occurs under our eyes during the time the patient is being admitted. So this is not something that has to do with a chronic progressive disease or with something that happened while the patient was at his home, like kidney ischemia or trauma or sepsis or infection. This is something that we do. In fact, the clinical characteristics, according to worsening heart failure, the one that matters most are severity of congestions. Look at the difference. Patients who will go on to develop worsening have much more likelihood to have more severe congestion. The ones that paradoxically we were most good at treating because we discharged them with a greater weight loss, and are the ones who received more furosemide. So what's the story? Presumably, those patients were overzealously treated. We pushed too far with diuretics. We pushed too far to achieving a weight loss, and in so doing, we precipitated renal failure. That's not just my interpretation. This is what statistics says. If we go back and look at what are the predictors of worsening of renal function in this population, it is severity of congestion and the dose of furosemide. Severity of congestion, of course, is what we would call a proxy. So it's an indicator of the fact that indeed then we will most likely go on pushing with diuretics and other things. And the other thing is, now if we're dealing mostly with a population of patients that is over 70, and they are by definition cardiac patients, by definition they have kidney dysfunction, most likely they will have also other diseases. What is the impact of concomitant disease in this population? Now this is interesting. This is another registry from Europe and from Italy, and again is part of the IN-HF survey that we participated on that I mentioned. Now this time is, what are the comorbidities in these patients and what the difference they do? Now here we have in black the in-hospital 30-day mortality, and in gray the mortality at 1 year. This is the whole population. This is according to glomerular filtration rate. I'm sure you have already seen these elsewhere, but just to remind you, those that were in the lowest quartile of renal function, which is still, I wouldn't say high, but not so tremendously depressed. You know, it's around 30. The cutoff point is 28 milliliters per minute. Had at 1 year, 44% of them had died. But who are those patients that have less than 40 milliliters per minute of glomerular filtration rate in Italy these days, with concomitant heart failure, of course? And once again, age, you see, 76 versus 71. More likely female, more likely to have diabetes. So it's kind of what we have already seen, one step taken, one step further. Now the interesting thing from the clinician and from the intensivist as well, and from the emergency room people as well, what does not matter at all is the clinical presentation of heart failure, the type of heart failure. So whether there is an acute coronary syndrome as the underlying mechanism, whether it is cardiogenic shock, whether it's a chronic, acutely decompensated heart failure, whether it's a right ventricular failure, anything, they are absolutely identical. So once again, this confirms what we have seen before in previous slides. It doesn't really, I mean, no matter what Ronco and friends wrote, that's useful to teach students. But when it comes to real life, our patients, they tend to develop kidney impairment regardless of the type or the mechanism. It's more closely linked to the severity of the disease and the presence of concomitant comorbidities, not so much to the pathophysiology. But there is something, though, that does make a difference, but has nothing to do with the heart, has nothing to do with the kidney in principle, is the presence of diabetes, which is not a surprise, of course, because being diabetic means that almost every organ fails more quickly. Now, this is in that same population of Italian patients admitted with acute heart failure and concomitant kidney dysfunction, whether they are diabetic or not, and you can see the all-cause mortality at 1 year is tremendously different. And why is that? Do we have, in addition to diabetes, other clues to any difference among these two groups? This is it. Age is not different this time, but they're already very old now. We're talking about more than 75 years old. Interesting, atrial fibrillation is not, or if anything is less. Systolic blood pressure is, so they most likely tend to have hypertension on top of diabetes. And also they tend to have substantial anemia, whereas glomerular filtration rate is not so different in the two groups. So it seems to be like a diffuse problem with being diabetic, not a specific kidney. And how about other comorbidities? How about kidney and the liver in our failure patients? Once again, el enfoque europeo. This is something that we did together with friends in Greece, looking with Gerasimos Philippatos, who is now currently the president of the European Heart Failure Association. And we looked at this database of acute heart failure patients in whom we were also able to have liver function data. We had a follow-up almost 2 years. 10% of these patients develop worsening of renal failure that were associated with a 2.5% increase in mortality. But let's have a better look at what the difference are. So who are patients who develop worsening of renal failure as opposed to those who do not? And the most difference is there's no difference in age, no difference, as you will see, in gender. Obviously, there was a difference in the functional status. There was much more frequent in higher advanced stage heart failure. And one again, interesting, etiology of heart failure did not matter, as we have seen before. Whether it was ischemic, dilated, valvular, no differences. Comorbidities, no difference, save for, once again, diabetes. Look at the difference in diabetes between the two groups. And what if we factor in also the role of liver function or dysfunction in these patients? Well, it's very impressive, because for one thing, by the way, this is how gamma GT, that, as you know, is a parameter of liver function, correlates with creatinine. There's an interesting association. The higher the creatinine, the higher the gamma GT value. And if we plot this, you will see the difference in mortality having gamma GT values above or below 50 units per liter. So in summary here, by Cox regression, increased gamma GT was an independent predictor of mortality. By adjusted multivariable was also independent predictor of renal worsening. And the Kaplan-Meier curve, which is here, show a statistically difference in survival in patients that had both worsening of renal and liver function, as opposed to patients who did not. So I would conclude saying that yes, this is a nice picture. It helps us to explain a number of things, but we have to understand that in reality, every day's patients are much more complex, and there is definitely a greater interplay with most of it is determined by the underlying clinical conditions of our patients. Thank you.
José.
Bueno, abrimos entonces durante unos minutos la discusión, todos se quieren preguntar. Profesora Atzar.
Interesante la charla, creo que abrió un poco más el panorama, Ambrosio, al final, cuando asoció la función hepática con la afectación renal, ¿no? Entonces yo diría que, y bueno, por supuesto la diabetes, que son factores de riesgo más importantes para la afectación renal en un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca. Pero no se debería llamar entonces síndrome cardiohepatometabólico renal.
Y sí.
Porque todos son factores.
Sí, esa es la senilidad. La suma de comorbidades.
Ahora, ¿por qué más en las mujeres? Porque los hombres se mueren antes.
Sí,
Exacto.
yo creo que sí.
Es lo que te decía.
Nos
Sí.
están matando las mujeres.
Sí. Es un selection bias.
Debido de
Además
selección.
de
Sesgo de
80 años son mujeres.
Más mujeres que
Son más mujeres que varones.
Yo quiero hacer un comentario de lo que dijo Asato y lo que dijo José.
Yo todo terminé.
Déjame decir algo. Siempre hablo.
Está bien.
Es así como vos decís. Tanto es así que, bueno, ha aparecido una serie de publicaciones y entre ellas el libro de un profesor también italiano, Giuseppe Mancia, donde un poco dice lo mismo que ha dicho el doctor Ambrosio, de que la clasificación sirve didácticamente,
Exacto.
pero que es mucho más amplio y que muestra un poco más tanto la parte hepática, sacando los trabajos también donde participó José, que además les digo que si quieren mandarme al mail yo se los mando por vía electrónica.
¿Cómo?
Les mando electrónicamente el libro.
Ahora,
Avanti.
¿por qué elegiste la gamma GT, que es la enzima hepática más falsa que hay para función hepática? Sube por cualquier cosa la gamma GT. Yo tomo medio vaso de vino y me sube.
Por eso.
Es la más sensible.
Por eso, porque es la más sensible y no es sensible solamente a la necrosis de los hepatocitos como la transaminasa. Sí. Sí. Y parece que hay también una correlación con la inflamación hepática. Citoquinas.
Ahora, al panel, ¿cuál es la causa? Vos dijiste muy bien, la causa de muerte, la insuficiencia renal aguda en los pacientes con trastornos hemodinámicos, sepsis y demás. Ahora, ¿cuál es? ¿Es la necrosis tubular? ¿Es la afectación glomerular? ¿Eso sigue siendo así, la necrosis tubular, la causa más común de insuficiencia renal aguda?
No. La necrosis tubular aguda es una parte.
Una parte.
Es una parte de la historia, cada vez vemos menos y cada vez hay más sufrimiento de la parte tubular y todo lo que es el balance glomérulo-tubular también. Sí, por eso. La necrosis tubular aguda no es que no haya, pero está siendo menos de lo que era antes. Por eso hay una nueva clasificación también de la enfermedad renal aguda, que bueno, por razones de tiempo no hablo ninguno, que es toda la clasificación Rifle, que sumamos al Apache, por ejemplo, en las unidades de terapia intensiva. ¿Mi capillito?
Sí.
El riesgo tanto de mortalidad como de sobrevida renal, como de sobrevida por otras causas, digamos, estamos sumando índices para establecer pronóstico. Tal vez no lo tengamos para tratamiento, creo que no sé si tenemos mucho.
Yo pienso que probablemente el aumento del diagnóstico, de la tasa de diagnóstico de insuficiencia renal, tiene que ver que se ha agudizado la óptica sobre la lesión renal, porque uno sabe perfectamente bien que no es lo mismo un paciente ventilado por un distrés respiratorio con insuficiencia renal aguda que si no la tiene. No es lo mismo un paciente con insuficiencia cardíaca, con insuficiencia renal, que si no la tiene, porque claramente aumenta muchísimo la morbimortalidad. Entonces creo que tener presente para mí estas pequeñas variaciones de los niveles de creatinina realmente es muy importante, es muy importante tenerlo presente como para establecer estrategias protectivas en la medida que uno puede. Así como también se lo protege al pulmón en el distrés respiratorio con determinados mililitros por kilo, yo creo que al riñón también hay que protegerlo de algunas medidas terapéuticas. Nosotros tuvimos un capítulo muy interesante que son los pacientes hiperobesos, y hemos tenido un sinnúmero de pacientes hiperobesos que han ingresado en edema agudo de pulmón, y es muy interesante, llegaron prácticamente anúricos, fueron atendidos de emergencia en la guardia, goteo de furosemida, y de repente yo creo que va a haber que modificar hasta el paradigma terapéutico, porque a lo mejor no va a haber que ser tan exigente, a lo mejor hay que intubarlos precozmente y ventilarlos y tratarle por otros medios de disminuir la precarga, no ser tan exigentes con la furosemida, tener en cuenta la presión intraabdominal, que es tan importante. Bueno.
No, sí, estaba pensando que una cosa interesante que no sabemos nada es que tienes que ver con la vasoconstricción de la arteriola aferente, es el efecto de la presión pulsatoria de la sangre. Porque yo digo, porque ahora estamos implantando el sistema de asistencia ventricular izquierda, que son bombas centrífugas, y hay una presión constante, no hay el pulso, y todos los pacientes desarrollan necrosis tubular aguda.
A lo mejor la presión sostenida puede ser que ese sea el factor determinante.
Por suerte, como sabes, es una cosa que se puede manejar a lo largo de una semana, van a recuperar, pero todos desarrollan una
¿Hay algún informe que dice que en realidad funcionaría cuando es continua como si fuera el pico del pulso constantemente, y que por eso llegarían, y que esa digamos subida y bajada de la onda de pulso genera una autorregulación que desaparece cuando la onda es continua?
Tal cual.
Y un detalle clínico que también hay que tener en cuenta es: hay todo un capítulo de la bioquímica que tiene que ver con el error preanalítico. Y hay que tener presente que un paciente cuando tiene más de 4 o más de bilirrubina, los valores de creatinina son absolutamente falsos o subvaluados. O sea que uno puede tener un paciente que tenga 4 de bilirrubina por algún otro motivo, y a lo mejor uno está tranquilo que tiene 1.2 de creatinina. Ojo con eso, porque así como el aumento de las proteínas en la sangre modifica el valor de la natremia y uno puede tener pseudohiponatremia, ojo con bilirrubina. O sea, este capítulo del error preanalítico, que creo que cada vez vamos a tener que tener más información.
No, esto me interesa por el dato que presentamos de gamma GT creatinina? ¿Cómo sería si la bilirrubina
Es más de 4,
sí,
puede modificar y subvaluar el valor de creatinina.
bajándolo?
Exactamente,
Sí.
por eso
El valor verdadero es más alto.
El valor verdadero es más alto.
Los
Lo mismo
subvalúa.
que lo mismo que yo algo para tener en cuenta es la sarcopenia, que muchas veces uno tiene
Sí,
un paciente.
pero
Yo miraba-
la pregunta era si el aumento que vemos de la gamma GT y de la creatinina, es posible que los pacientes que han gamma GT aumentada, algunos tienen también
Más de lo que
bilirrubina.
dice el análisis.
por ejemplo, no lo tengo registrado con respecto a valor de bilirrubina y error preanalítico con respecto a la gamma GT. Pero sí con la creatinina.
Yo pienso que con gamma GT aumentada es más
Debería
fácil.
ser. Bueno, hay que ver, hay que buscar. Hay que buscar eso. Yo quiero hacer otro comentario. Cuando hablamos hoy, cuando recién se dijo pequeños aumentos que dijiste vos, el aumento es 0,3 miligramos por decilitro de la creatinina en un paciente agudo tiene que poner en alerta. La utilización de IECA-UARA2, que es obligatoria para todo paciente con enfermedad renal crónica, tiene que hacer pensar dos cosas que por falta de tiempo no dije. Generalmente asciende, hay un leve ascenso de creatinina que no debe superar el 30%. Y además, si supera el 30%, por ejemplo, si el paciente tenía 2 de creatinina, se va a 2,50, no pasa nada. Pero si tenía 2 y se va a 3, sospechar que pueda tener una estenosis de la arteria renal. Y en esos pacientes sí es la única contraindicación absoluta la estenosis de la arteria renal bilateral, porque el flujo plasmático depende de la angiotensina 2. Si le estamos quitando y le cortamos ese único mecanismo, el paciente desarrolla una insuficiencia renal aguda casi irreversible.
Esa es la situación.
Bueno, ¿alguien más?
Decime, ¿la presión intraabdominal la monitoreás en todos los pacientes o solamente en los obesos?
Todos los pacientes.
En todos.
Es un parámetro más en la terapia intensiva. Todos los pacientes tienen determinación de
¿Cómo
PIA.
haces con
Se hace muy sencillo, hay varios métodos, pero a través de la sonda vesical con un circuito cerrado y un traductor, inyectando 25 mililitros de solución salina, uno tiene la determinación de la presión intraabdominal. O sea, hay sets cerrados para poder hacerlo, pero uno diría que con la sonda vesical, con un sistema cerrado, uno lo puede hacer perfectamente bien.
¿Tiene variabilidad diaria?
Tiene variabilidad porque la presión intraabdominal depende de varios mecanismos. Por ejemplo, si uno no es lo mismo el paciente si está constipado que no está constipado, si tiene distensión gástrica, depende de la posición que tiene el cuerpo, la carga que tiene el abdomen. O sea, por eso es preferible cuando uno tiene que reducir la presión intraabdominal con medios no farmacológicos, poner la cama en posición de tren del lémur invertido, que el paciente reciba laxantes, que esté bien drenado a través de la sonda nasogástrica. Son todas medidas importantes.
El mecanismo del aumento de la presión intraabdominal es la disminución de la presión de perfusión a nivel del linfático.
Exactamente, porque sigue perfectamente la ley de Pascal, que el aumento de esa presión intraabdominal va a comprimir la vena y la arteria renal, va a comprimir el hígado, o sea, tiene una función fundamentalmente mecánica. Y por eso estos pacientes casi todos son hipertensos. Un obeso hay que pensar que tenga un body mass index mayor de 40, todos tienen más de 10 milímetros de mercurio seguro. Y hemos visto ya cada vez más un sinnúmero de pacientes que se operan, tienen operaciones, te diría, benignas, como pueden ser una operación de meniscos o una operación intraabdominal, y que se agrega otra morbilidad en este grupo de pacientes, que es la rhabdomiólisis posoperatoria. Hay que pensar de que la rhabdomiólisis, como causa de deterioro de la función renal, tiene dos variantes: tiempo y presión. A uno le pueden pasar 2 ruedas duales de un camión por encima, uno tuvo mucha presión en poco tiempo. El paciente que está en la cama, en la mesa de terapia de quirófano, tiene poca presión, pero durante mucho tiempo. En este caso, si es un obeso, tiene más.
La embarazada.
Y eso produce... Bueno, es muy interesante, es un mecanismo progresivo el de la embarazada, ¿no? Pero tiene el aumento de la presión intrabdominal, seguro. Y por eso, seguro. Y yo creo que debe tener seguramente que ver con el desarrollo de algún tipo de gestosis.
Compensación crónica. Bien.
Sí.
Bueno, interesante.
Bueno,
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 muchas gracias.
muchas gracias.